Today's subject on the work Intellectual Intifada, which was actually written earlier last year before October the 7th, 2023, the events of October the 7th in occupied Palestine. Those events are related to the subject matter of the book. Now, the book has a young man, a Palestinian man, with shorts on and slippers, similar to people today who have shorts and slippers, yet they are able to defeat trained military terrorists who may carry out terrorist attacks in their native home. But the young man is not carrying a weapon. He's actually carrying a brain. That's a brain. And it goes in with the title Intellectual Intifada. And Intifada refers back to a concept going back to the year 1987, not even 40 years ago. In 1987, we had the first Intifada, the first shaking off. Intifada means to shake off. The first shaking off of tyranny within the occupied territories. And remember, the entire Palestine is occupied. It's not limited to West Bank and Gaza. The whole land is occupied. It's all occupied land. Because during the British mandate, when the British were administrating Palestine, the landowners, 95% of them were indigenous Palestinians. 95%. Yet, a huge percentage of the land, 55% of the land, was allocated to a foreign alien, non-Semitic people from Eastern Europe, who may claim that they are in fact Semitic, but they are not Semitic. They do not have Semitic roots. They have Khazar roots, going back to the 8th century, when the Khazar tribes adopted Judaism. And then a minority of them do have Semitic roots, but the majority of the Bani Israel, in fact, adopted Islam and became known as Palestinians. So the Palestinians are a good mix of Arabs, Arab tribes, but also of the original Bani Israel. But the Intifada in 1987 occurred, which was known as the first Palestinian Intifada. This continued until 1993, and then you had the failed Oslo Accords. And within the time of Bill Clinton, from 1993 onwards, 40,000 acres of Palestinian land was lost to the occupation forces. And then by the year 2000, you had the second Intifada. That second Intifada, it lasted from the year 2000 to the year 2005. Much of it was ignored, or many people did not pay attention to the second Intifada because of the events of 9/11 in the United States and the subsequent invasion of Iraq in 2003, and prior to that, the invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001. There was the campaign of the war on terror. During that campaign, on an adjective, terror, while America launched its war on an adjective, a war on terror, which entailed that, in fact, the United States is waging a war on civilians within various Muslim majority states. During that time, the likes of Benjamin Netanyahu, the current occupier of Palestine, and they actually praised, on record, praised the attacks of 9/11 because it validates and justifies a war on Muslims. It supports the cause of international Zionism, a justification of a war against Islam and against Muslims. And then, of course, in 2006, the occupying forces, they left Gaza. And ever since, Gaza was a concentration camp. And that is why the dedication includes our children, the lines of Gaza and Kashmir. I mentioned Kashmir also. Events are unfolding in Kashmir. Kashmir is currently under lockdown. While the BJP in India, the government of Modi, has intent on carrying out genocide, intent of mass conversion of Muslims to Hinduism. That is the intent of some Hindu extremists within India, Hind, Biladul Hind. That is the intent of the BJP. Even though India claims to be a democratic secular state, this contradicts the ethos of being democratic and secular. So there are issues within Biladul Hind in India for the Muslims of India today. The butcher of Gujarat, Modi and the BJP, but also the lockdown in Kashmir. There is a military occupation in Kashmir where for every 10 civilians of Kashmir, there is one soldier in terms of statistics. So when we have concentration camps, I mentioned the largest concentration camps on earth, Gaza is mentioned, Kashmir is mentioned. And Kashmir also is a place that must be observed. We must observe Kashmir. The way we were observing Gaza before October the 7th, the way we were advocating for Palestine, we must advocate for Kashmir before that tinderbox explodes. There will be events in the near future in Kashmir also. The way the world is observing Gaza and Palestine, the world will observe Kashmir and wider Hind, Biladul Hind, and the Muslims of Hind. And that is why it's essential for Muslims to pray for the Muslims of Hind, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala safeguards them from the tyranny of extremism. So like we have the tyranny of extremism in Palestine, of the Zionists, we have a tyranny of extremism in Biladul Hind. So the dedication was for the people of Gaza. So ever since 2006, Gaza was occupied, and we've had ignorant Zionists stating that why should Gaza rely upon us for gas, electricity, and water when they do not mention the historical context that Gaza was occupied by the occupying forces, the IDF, from the year 1967. And from that occupation, when settlements were dismantled within Gaza, the occupying forces, the IDF, when they left Gaza, they left the region in such a way that it became a huge concentration camp. And the people were therefore dependent upon the occupying forces. It was not out of choice. Additionally, they held raving parties outside of this concentration camp. Who in their right mind holds parties outside of a huge concentration camp? So the current Zionist regime is in fact a Nazi occupying force. The current state, the illegal state that they have, the Knesset, the governing body, is actually equivalent to Nazism in 1940s Germany, in 1930s Germany. That is what we are facing today. But these events that we observe today go back to 1924, the official dismantlement of the khilafah, al-khilafah al-Islamiyah. And that interlocks with what? With Palestine in a few ways. One of them is firstly with regard to prophecy. Sayyiduna Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam mentioned in a hadith, for which I give citation to within the work, that the khilafah shall move from city to city. Words to the effect. It moved from Al-Madinah Al-Munawwarah to Damashq. So even though Sayyiduna Ali radiallahu anhu, he went to Al-Kufa, Al-Kufa was not the capital. The capital was still Al-Madinah Al-Munawwarah. The reason for migrating to Al-Kufa was to prevent any conflict flaring up within Al-Madinah Al-Munawwarah. But after the passing away of Sayyiduna Ali radiallahu anhu, Al-Imam Al-Hasan radiallahu anhu was the fifth Khalifa. After him, you had Amir Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, based in Damascus. After Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, the bay'ah was not finalized with Yazid, because the Ahlul Halli wal Aqd, they did not give the bay'ah to Yazid. Al-Imam Hussein radiallahu anhu, he was the leader of Ahlul Halli wal Aqd. He refused to give the bay'ah. He was martyred in Karbala. And likewise, Abdullah bin Az-Zubayr radiallahu anhuma, he did not give the oath of allegiance to Yazid, and he became the Amir in Makkah al-Mukarramah. In fact, the people of Makkah al-Mukarramah, they gave the bay'ah to Abdullah bin Az-Zubayr radiallahu anhuma. Events transpired that Yazid, he passes away, and when Yazid passes away, the son of Yazid, whose name was also Muawiyah, was actually a very pious person. He refused to govern. And then when he passes away, under suspicious circumstances, the official Bani Umayyah commences. And the capital, de facto capital, is Damascus. So as a dastur, as a constitution, it is a khilafah. It is a khilafah. What is the meaning of khilafah? As a dastur, as a constitution, irrelevant to whether the khalifa is pious or not. So the meaning of al-khilafatul Rashida is when the khalifa, he imposes the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam upon himself and upon the subjects. And this is why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said the khilafah Rashida will last 30 years. After that, it shall be kingship. What is the meaning of this? Of al-mulukiyah. It entails that the Banu Umayyah, and after them the Banu al-Abbas, and after them the Banu Uthman, the Ottoman. All of these are Maluk, but it does not negate Khilafah. Khilafah as governance. It only means Al-Khilafatul Rashida lasted 30 years. But within that timeline of history, there are sporadic periods of Al-Khulafa al-Rashidun, like whom? Like Umar bin Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah ta'ala, who was Khalifa from the year 99 Hijri to the year 101 Hijri, who revived the deen of Al-Islam. So Al-Khilafah, up until 1924, is Dastur. It's the constitution that governs the majority Muslim world. Even though on the eastern flank we had the Mughal dynasty, we also had the Shia dynasty in Iran, in modern day Iran, a buffer zone between the Mughal dynasty and the Ottoman Caliphate. And in the west, you had the Maghariba, the Moroccans, but prior to that, you also had the claims of Khilafah in Al-Andalusia. But the central body was always based, meaning around Al-Hijaz, and the Caliphate was based firstly in Damascus, after Al-Madinah Al-Munawwarah. Then it moves from Al-Madinah Al-Munawwarah to Baghdad in the time of Banu al-Abbas. So the Banu al-Abbas from the year 131 Hijri, they construct the city of Baghdad. And in the hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam refers to Baghdad as Zawra. So in the hadith that prophesied that a city will be ransacked by the Mongols, an event to occur well over 600 years after Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, it is foretold in the works of hadith that were compiled hundreds of years before those events occurred, entailing that the compilation of the hadith was authentic, was reliable. The Banu al-Abbas, they transferred the capital to Baghdad. Then, as history moves on, you have the rise of Banu Uthman and the Ottoman khulafa. Why are they khulafa? According to Shaykh Abdul Ghani al-Nablusi, rahimahullah ta'ala, they were from Quraysh. They had descent from Quraysh. So what happens? The Banu al-Abbas formally acknowledges the Caliphate of Banu Uthman in Egypt. And the Khilafah continues until the year 1924, which entails its formal abolition. But during this time, the Khilafah transfers from Baghdad to which city? To the city of Al-Qustuntinya, Constantinople, today known as Istanbul, known as Astana, known as Islambul. It has many names, but Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam referred to it as Constantinople, Al-Qustuntinya. This now becomes the fourth capital of the Khilafah. So by the year 1924 and the formal abolition of the Khilafah in Al-Qustuntinya, there is a fifth city prophesied. Of course, the conquering of Al-Quds is prophesied in other hadith. That has already happened. But there is a fifth city mentioned in the hadith that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentions that the Khilafah, the final seat of the Khilafah, shall be Baytul Maqdis. It has over 17 names, like Ilya. It has Ilya, Baytul Maqdis, Al-Baytul Muqaddas. Over how many names? 17 different names. كثرة الأسماء تدل على كثرة الشرف. Numerous names indicate to nobility of the place. And of course, we do not need to recount the importance of the entire region, Bilad al-Sham, and specifically the city of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, regarding which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam informed us, لا تزال طائفة من أمتي ظاهرين على الحق. They shall never cease being a group from a nation apparent on the truth, and also يقاتلون في سبيل الله, killing and fighting in the way of Allah. But it mentions وهم منصورون, they will be supported as well. It mentions وهم على أبواب القدس وأكنافها, they shall be around the doors of Al-Quds and the surrounding regions. And Al-Asqalan is mentioned in a hadith also. Remember, there are a few regions which are mentioned as being bastions of Islam in Akhir al-Zaman. One of them is Taliqan. Taliqan is in Afghanistan today. Taliqan. The second is Al-Quds al-Sharif. The third is Damashq, the city of Damascus. The fourth is Al-Asqalan. Remember, the Yahud, they refer to it as what? Ashkelon. Al-Asqalan. Because what they attempt to do is make the names Hebrew and Hebrew sounding. But we should always attempt to mention the names in Arabic. And the fifth one that is mentioned is Al-Antakiya, which is Antioch in Turkey, modern day Turkey. That is mentioned in hadith. So what occurs now prior to the formal abolition of the Khilafah? David Lloyd George, from the cabinet of our country here, our country of birth, our country of nationality, not country of origin. We can have various places of origin, but remember, to the English racist, you should say St. George was from which country? From Palestine. So to the English far right, we say the saint of England, St. George, was a Palestinian, before you bring out your racist rhetoric for us stating this is our country. Because we were born here, we have the nationality. Our ancestors, some of our ancestors even fought for this country. My grandfather was stationed in the British Army in Burma. He fought for Britain. And similarly, many of us, there were certain groups, ethnic groups within Pakistan, modern day Pakistan, that were actually recruited into the British Army because they made good soldiers. We were from that. So by us stating we are British, there is nothing wrong with this. But remember, the right wing, the likes of Tommy Robinson, should remember that St. George was a Palestinian ethnically. He was racially a Palestinian. You may refer to him as a Paki if you saw him today, because he was a Palestinian. So David Lloyd George, in that cabinet, he states, in fact, in his diaries, that while the cabinet was making decisions for Palestine, they were unable to consult the Palestinians. Why were they unable to consult the Palestinians? The response is very simple. He states most of them were living under Ottoman territory and were loyal to the Ottomans. I repeat that again. They were loyal to the Ottomans. Why do I mention this? Because some people, they say ignorant things. One of those ignorant things that they say is that the Palestinians are being punished because of their treachery to the Ottomans. Sometimes Turkish nationalists say this out of racism. Some people say this out of ignorance. But they should know that the majority of the people, Muslims in Bilad al-Sham, and especially in Palestine, were loyal to the Ottomans. They were subjects of the Ottomans and they were loyal to the Ottomans. Who was disloyal to the Ottomans? The current ruling elite of Jordan, the Sharif of Mecca. The Sharif of Mecca, at that time, he was made the Sharif of Mecca al-Mukarramah by Sultan Abdul Hamid al-Thani, rahimahullah ta'ala. But later his son Faisal, with T.E. Lawrence, they attacked the port of Aqaba, which enabled General Allenby in the year 1917, in the winter of 1917, to enter Palestine and occupy the city of Jerusalem. And that is when Arthur Balfour, he writes down his famous Balfour Declaration to the most prestigious Jewish Zionist citizen of Britain at the time, Lord Rothschild. Lord Rothschild at that time, Lionel Rothschild, the small letter of what is known as the Balfour Declaration is sent to him, declaring a Jewish state in its embryonic form. Remember that Rothschild had already purchased land in Palestine from unwary landowners who simply thought this is a businessman interested in purchasing, or the Jewish people are interested in business, interested in agriculture, and they sold their land. These were the early steps to entrenching themselves within the land of Palestine. And in fact, Greater Israel entails what? Greater Israel entails occupation of Egypt from the Nile all the way to Iraq, to the Euphrates. This is why the Arab dictators currently that support the state, the occupation, they do not realize that the long-term goals of the current occupation are in fact to occupy parts of Egypt, parts of Lebanon, all of Asham, Syria, and all the way up to the Euphrates River, but including Al-Madinah Al-Munawwarah. Because of the former settlements, the Jewish settlements that were within the Arabian Peninsula. That is what is referred to Haretz Israel, meaning what? Greater Israel, the Greater Israel plan. And of course, those sentiments were stated by people within the IDF. Those statements are, and remember, the Knesset parliament, so-called democratic Knesset that they have, this comprises of people who are actually former IDF. Benjamin Netanyahu, Yitzhak Rabin, all those names that we may mention that are associated with governance in Israel, past and present, Ariel Sharon, all of them, they are all former IDF and military. The military controls the occupation. It's actually a garrison state. It's a garrison state, illegal state, garrison fort, garrison entity that is constructed on the land that does not belong to them. It belongs to the Palestinian Arabs, including the Christian Palestinian Arabs also, the Ahlul Dhimma, people who are protected by Muslims. Because Deen al-Islam protected all the Ahlul Dhimma who resided in that region, unlike the Zionist occupation, which kills indiscriminately. It kills Muslims, it kills Christians, and I would say it even kills Jewish people. That is why the khilafah is the safest governance for the Jewish people within Palestine. It protects them better than a Zionist entity. So that occurs in 1917, that David Lloyd George, he states that the Palestinians are loyal to the Ottomans. We have the entrenchment of what became known as the State of Israel within that land, but we have many reforms occurring around the Muslim majority regions. Reforms. What type of reforms? Because we have the formal abolition of the Khilafah, there is a replacement of governance. So the hadith mentions that after the Maluk, after you have Al-Khilafah, Al-Rashida, ala Nahj al-Nabuwah, you will have Al-Muluk, kings, which stretched for a long period of time, but the difference was that they had a dastur which was Islamic. Irrelevant to whether the Khalifa was a tyrant or unrighteous, the governance was still correct. For instance, Harun al-Rashid, under his rule, one of the khulafa of Banu al-Abbas, you had Al-Imam Abu Yusuf, rahimallahu ta'ala, the student of Al-Imam Abu Hanifa, writing out a dastur, Kitab al-Kharaj, writing out a way of governance, to the point that the book even details how to fix broken dams, water dams. There was better water conservation under Banu al-Abbas and Banu Uthman, the Ottomans, better water conservation than the modern state system. How they were able to construct an aqueduct from the Euphrates River all the way to the land of Arafat. In the time of Harun al-Rashid, they had an aqueduct which brought water, fresh drinking water for the Hujjaj. The wife of Harun al-Rashid, Zabida, she was the one who paid for the construction of this aqueduct. Imagine that in that time. Better administration, that the water was, the current occupation in Palestine, the Zionist occupation, they cannot even administer the water correctly. You have the Sea of Galilee, the lake, Tiberias Lake, Tabriya, that the water levels of the lake are dissipating, one of the signs of the end of times. The water levels are decreasing to the point of no return. And similarly, the Euphrates mismanaged, especially after Saddam Hussein. So Saddam Hussein is toppled in the year 2003. We have had 21 years of American occupation of Al-Iraq, even though they have formally left. The United States still has a puppet government within Al-Iraq and military bases. And the administration has left such a bad impact on the land of Al-Iraq that the water of the Euphrates is diminishing. Bad water administration. So 1200 years of Caliphate entailed that farmers, the land from Morocco to Al-Iraq, the farmers had better administration to the point that the land was not overtaxed. They were never burdened with taxation. They were able to farm. Even in Palestine, prior to the current occupation, a Muslim could travel from Al-Iraq across the border into Bilad al-Sham, across the border into Palestine. There was no border, in fact. They could travel, reach Jaffa, the port of Jaffa. So you know, we eat Jaffa cakes. Jaffa is what? The port of Jaffa. A Palestinian occupied by the occupation forces, Palestinian town in which the Palestinians grew oranges. And people would go, they would collect those oranges. They would go and take the oranges away to Iraq. They would go back to wherever they came from. No tax. Free trade, real free trade. People were able to trade utilizing gold and silver, not polymer notes, not paper currency which has no intrinsic value. They would use gold and silver. So the administration was better than the administration we have today. The only thing that has improved in the past 100 years is technology and sanitation. But when someone observes the level of sanitation and infrastructure of the Ottoman Caliphate, they will realize that it was an advanced civilization. The Ottomans, the Uthmaniyun. How? That when we had earthquakes in the past, in the 1990s, within Turkey, modern secular Turkey, all the modern buildings, they fall, they crumble. But you will observe that the Ottoman buildings stay upright. Similar to the Victorian structures, were better constructed and better built than the modern construction that we have today. So never undermine our history, never undermine the civilization that we had in that region. But after the formal abolition in 1924, the surrounding countries, they undergo reform. reform of constitution based upon racial, ethnic and linguistical lines. And that is harmful. How is that harmful? It's harmful for what we refer to as the Middle East, because the Middle East is one of the most diverse regions in the world. When you have such a diverse region, you cannot divide it on linguistical, ethnical grounds. Like what occurred in Biladul Hind. When they formed Pakistan in 1947, in August 1947, many of you are familiar of 14th of August. They had a decision to make: which language shall we make the national language of our country? What are the options? You have Hindi, you have Farsi, you have Urdu, but you also have Arabic. They go, and you also have another language. Which one? Bengali. They go with the choice of Urdu. A wrong choice. Why? Because Pakistan was made in the name of Al-Islam. Therefore, the right choice of language was only Arabic. But that choice of going with Urdu divides the entire nation. How? In the events of 1970 and 1971, when Bangladesh, which was known as East Pakistan, separates from Pakistan based upon ethnic and linguistical foundations. When Islam unites the people, it does not divide the people. Similarly, in the Middle East, you have Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, who was a Kurdi, but you have Nuruddin Zangi rahimahullah ta'ala, who was Turk, and you have the majority of the residents of those countries who were Arab. So you have an army of Arabs and Kurds and Turks, and they fight the Crusaders. Why were they united? Based upon Deenul Islam. So what occurs is the division of the Muslim lands according to racial and linguistical lines. This is why Lebanon was separated from Asham, because the French, they wanted a Christian bastion within the Middle East. They wanted a Christian fort within the Middle East. So they separated Lebanon, when in reality Lebanon is a part of Bilad Sham. And they make divisions to this point. To this day, Israeli Zionists would want Syria to be divided into three, based upon ethnic and religious divisions. How? They would want the one region of Lazikia made into a Nusayri region, because the majority or many residents there are Nusayri, a minority sect within Bilad Sham. They would want Lazikia to be what? A Nusayri region. They would want the north to be a Kurdish region. And they would want Damascus to be a majority Sunni region. That is the division that they want in Syria alone. Then they would want Iraq to be divided in three also. They would want the Sunni triangle, what is referred to as the Sunni triangle, which is Mosul, Tikrit, these type of areas, being made into what? Into a Sunni region. And then the northern areas into Kurdistan, a separate region. And then they would want Baghdad and the central parts of Iraq into a Shi'i majority region. This is division of the Muslims, division of the Middle East. And similarly, divide Egypt perhaps with a Coptic region, when in reality the Copt Christians have had ta'ayush with the Muslims for centuries. So in the long term, we've had division of the Muslim lands based upon ethnical and linguistical differences. And then constitutions that will have Islam only as a coating, not at the essence and the core. Because, for instance, the constitution of Pakistan, how can you have claim to be an Islamic republic? Remember, there's a contradiction between the two terms. You cannot be Islamic and a republic. You cannot be a republic and Islamic. But within the constitution, you have no clear prohibition of a riba, banking interest. Because the entire region then was joined with what? Global banking. So the global banking system, even though within the Ottoman territories, the bankers encroached within the region from the Tanzimat movement in the 1830s. From the 1830s, when the Sultan took bank loans from private bankers to construct a railway system from Vienna to Istanbul, incurring riba, that led to the Ottoman Caliphate falling into debt. And when you are indebted, those you are indebted to they will demand reforms, and they did demand reforms. From amongst those reforms was abolition of the jizya. What was the jizya? The Balkan states and Eastern Europe, which was governed by the Muslim Ottomans, those minority groups, they, when they would farm, the ushr was taken from them, or the kharaj. What is the kharaj? Not the ushr. Ushr is from Muslims, kharaj from the non-Muslims. It is only taking 1/10 or 1/20 of the cultivation. It's not a heavy tax. It's not burdensome. And when Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh, for instance, he conquered Jerusalem, for every 20 dirhams, he would take 1 dirham from the Christians. Those who were able to afford it. Not a heavy tax at all. It's not heavy. The Muslims governed these religious groups in such a way for hundreds of years. But what did the Western bankers, private bankers, demand from the Ottoman Sultan? They said, abolish the jizya. And today, even in Lebanon, you have Christians who think the jizya was a bad thing. The jizya was not a bad thing. The Christians were not oppressed. But the Sultan, he abolishes the jizya, and instead, the reforms, the tanzimat, they superimpose a heavy taxation upon the minority groups. That leads to rebellion. So the Ottomans, towards the end, they were heavily taxing various groups. And what occurred? You had rebellions from the Christians. They were rebelling. And this is why by the time in the 1870s, when Sultan Abdul Hamid Thani, rahimahullah ta'ala, he ascends to the throne of Ottoman Caliphate, he loses some territory because there were people rebelling against the tanzimat, the reforms that had occurred, Western style reforms. So by the formal abolition in 1924, and then the reforms within the Muslim world, like we have reforms today. How do we have reforms today? The Saudi government takes advice for economy. One of its advisors is whom? It's Tony Blair. Tony Blair, who ironically is referred to as what? Peace envoy to the Middle East. Peace envoy to the Middle East, Tony Blair. Tony Blair and his organization, when they advise Arab governments how to govern, one of the points of advice is to increase taxation, like we have in Britain. So now in Saudi Arabia, many of you would have noticed when you go for Al-Hajj and Al-Umrah, you will notice that the prices have increased. Aside from inflation, the prices have increased because they have introduced VAT tax. Arabs never knew VAT tax. The Arabs would look down upon what they refer to as dariba or al-makus, unfair taxation. But the Arab Gulf states have increased taxation. The UAE also takes advice from the likes of Tony Blair. The Zionists advise them how to run their economies. This is why they increase taxation. And cost of living increases in those countries and elsewhere. So the reforms entail what? A Western-style economic system. And those countries that were influenced by socialism, you had the likes of Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1950s, and the Baath Party within Iraq under Saddam Hussein, and the Baath Party in Syria under the Assad regime. They were influenced by socialist Marxism, and they aligned themselves with Russia. So when Gamal Abdel Nasser was clashing with the West, that in fact was a clash between Russian interests and Western interests. Of course, that's a different subject. But the reforms that occurred within the region entailed a removal of anything that we had inherited from the khilafah. I'll give you an example. Well over 20 years ago, when I first visited Damascus, what interested me was that the weekend in Damascus was Thursday and Friday. So Thursday was like Saturday is here. And I found that culturally very strange. But why did they have that? Because they had inherited that from the Ottoman Caliphate. So Thursday and Friday is Saturday and Sunday. Thursday and Friday. A few years later, they changed the weekend in Syria also in order to realign with the international community. So the weekend now is Friday and Saturday. But it took them nearly 100 years to do so. Similarly, when I would teach certain books, some of the ulama, they mention Wednesday is a happy day for the believers and a difficult day for the unbelievers. It only made sense when I realized why they say this. Wednesday is like Friday is for non-Muslims. The weekend is approaching. And it is middle of the week for the non-believers. Similarly, when in Al-Masjid al-Nabawi al-Sharif, when you enter Babu Salam to give salam to the best of creation, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you will notice on the right-hand side, aside from Dala'il al-Khairat, written on the wall, you will notice a clock. That clock is al-waqtul Arabi, Arabic time. What does, before Greenwich Mean Time? Greenwich Mean Time is from 1844. But prior to Greenwich, you had other central ways of determining the time. But nevertheless, you had al-waqtul Arabi. What does it mean? It means that the midnight in the Muslim Caliphate was Salatul Maghrib. Every time the Salatul Maghrib happens, it's midnight. So 12 every day, the clock would change by a minute according to the change in Salatul Maghrib. But today we are accustomed to midnight according to GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. These are the psychological impacts on the mind from over 100 years ago. The world people lived in 100 years ago is different to the world we live in today. But these were the reforms. Additionally, curriculum changed in the Middle East. Many years ago when I studied in Damascus, there were mashayikh who complained about young Arabs not knowing nahaw, Arabic grammar. Why was Arabic grammar removed from the curriculum? Additionally, some Christian missionaries attempt to divide the Arab world according to the lahjat, the dialects. When al-lughat al-fusha, Arabic, eloquent Arabic, classical Arabic, unites the Arabs. So if you have al-fusha from Maghrib, from Morocco, all the way to Iraq, and I would say it should include Pakistan and Bangladesh also, and Malaysia and Indonesia. The Arabic language, the language of the Quran unites all these Muslims. But when you divide them according to their languages, it disunites them. So they attempt to disunite the Arabs amongst themselves, that to rename the Arabic dialects as different languages. A false claim. So these are the changes that occurred in the Arab mind, that you had a change of curriculum in the schools. Young Arabs were taught that the Ottomans were a Turkish occupation that undermined the Arabs. The Ottomans, many secular Arabs will tell you that the Ottomans were an occupying force. In fact, even in the speeches of Saddam Hussein, you hear he refers to it as ihtilal, because he's a Ba'athi socialist. He refers to it as ihtilal, meaning 800 years of Turkish occupation. But that does not resound with the ethos of the Islam within the Arab Muslims. Because when you talk to the Arab Muslim, they do not see it as an occupation. The true Muslim, irrelevant to the racial and linguistical origins of a Khalifa, the very essence of al-khilafah is Arab, in the sense that the Quran is Arabic. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is Arab. And the conditions of a Khalifa is that he must be from Quraysh. And this is why Banu Uthman, they had a Qurayshi lineage even produced, which is Shaykh Abdul Ghani al-Nablusi, he reproduces in the work that he wrote on the subject. So these were the changes that occurred. But what does intellectual intifada entail? Intellectual intifada addresses the modern mind. It addresses the modern mind that khilafah will return, because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam informed us that it will return, because you will have this period of al-khilafah al-rashida ala nahj al-nabuwah, the rightly guided caliphs on the prophetic model. Then you will have al-muluk, some of them good, some of them bad. Then you will have al-jababirah. Note here a term is utilized, jababirah. Why is this period referred to as al-jababirah, even though we had jababirah in the past? I would say there is a clear indication in the hadith by stating al-jababirah that their way of governance will be un-Islamic also. They will not govern according to al-Islam. Because when you had tyrants in the past, like Hajjaj bin Yusuf al-Thaqafi, a tyrant, nevertheless, when you address Hajjaj bin Yusuf, he would still refer back to the law of Allah. He never undermined ostensibly, the law of Allah, only in action. He never called for a different way of governing. So the Jababirah that we have today, they call people to other than the way of Allah. And the tyranny that we have today is different. Meaning, just observing in Bilad al-Sham in Syria alone, the tyranny carried out by Bashar al-Assad and his regime from prior to the events of what became known as the Arab Spring. It was wrongly titled the Arab Spring. But the prisons are full in Al-Iraq under Saddam Hussein. The prisons are full under Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. The prisons were full prior to him, meaning oppression of the people within the Middle East, within all those regimes. These indeed are times of Jababirah. And then some of them align themselves with the West. Some of them align themselves with Russia. And the people in the middle, meaning the communities that live in that region, they are killed, imprisoned, tortured, and then many of them are silenced. They cannot speak against tyranny. They cannot speak to power because of the situation in those lands. That is the point of Jababirah. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam informs us that the Khilafah shall return, and it shall return to Jerusalem. So when it was formally abolished in 1924, the jewel in the crown was the city of Jerusalem. For occupying forces, that was the jewel in the crown. Today, Donald Trump, he announces when he was president that Jerusalem is the official capital of the occupying garrison entity. But tomorrow the Muslims must announce, meaning we have already announced, but we shall formally wrestle Jerusalem out of Zionist control and re-establish the Khilafah. That shall happen irrelevant to whether people accept this or deny this. It's a prophecy that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam informed us regarding. But there is something that the book wanted to address. It addresses two groups of people. One group are the zealots, the likes of Daesh, what became known as ISIS. The zealots that we have, that when ISIS occupied parts of Syria and Iraq, they did not attack occupying forces in Palestine. They in fact killed Muslims and non-Muslims within Syria and Iraq unjustly, all under the name of Khilafah. But they did not even throw a grenade into the occupied region. In fact, Tel Aviv at the time, Mossad, was giving treatment to people in Syria, from Syria, people who were causing disruption in Bilad Sham in Syria, and giving them treatment in Tel Aviv. Because the objective of the Israeli entity is to sow disarray and discord amongst the Muslims and the Arabs. So the book addresses zealots, people who do not have this correct concept of Khilafah, that they think Khilafah is only is forcing people to grow their beard, for instance. So there were some strange videos that came out. When ISIS were beaten and they left certain villages, you had videos of old men shaving their beards because the ISIS were going around forcing people to grow their beards. I have been studying Sharia for well over 2 decades. There are ulama here present who have studied Sharia for all their lives into ripe old age. Never will you find in a book of Sharia that the khilafah of the past would go around forcing people to grow their beards. The most I found was that Aurangzeb, who was not a Khalifa, Aurangzeb, he was a Sultan in Hind. He would command some of his lieutenants that if someone grew their beard over a qubdah, over a fist amount, he would command them to trim the beard short in Hind. That's the most I found. So these zealots, they have their own preconceptions of how Khilafah is adopted and how measurements are carried out, how the institutions are made within the lands of the Khilafah. They have wrong concepts. Many of them zealots. Some of them are former prisoners. They grow a beard, they may wear a thobe, but they have no ilm of Sharia and the tatbiq, the application of the Sharia in everyday and age. Like Imam Ibn Abdin rahimahullah says, "Man lam ya'rif ahla zamani fahuwa jahilun." Whoever does not know the people of his time, he is ignorant. So the book is addressing that group of people. And at the other side of the spectrum, or the kaleidoscope, you have young Muslims and elderly Muslims also. People who may have lived under Ataturk and post-Ataturk. So an Ataturk style regime, that they are misinformed that the Khilafah is something backwards and not applicable in the modern age. You have many of them in Pakistan, in the secular elite. They will inform you that the Khilafah is a bygone age. You cannot have Khilafah in the modern age. How will the Khilafah govern in terms of finance, economic system, its penal code, application of punishments in the modern age? So the book addresses that mindset also. Because what you have is ifrat and tafrit, the two extremes of the spectrum. So that is what the book addresses. And you can say in one sense, it's an update of the works of Al-Imam al-Mawardi, the author of Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyah, the work of Al-Imam Abu al-Ma'ali, Abdul Malik al-Jawayni al-Ghiyathi, he had a book on the Caliphate, and the works of other classical ulama who wrote on the subject, and near contemporary ulama also, who wrote on the subject. Some of them are known, some of them are unknown. And that is who the book addresses, the modern mind. So inshallah, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you benefit from reading the book, The book is available at the back, and that you, inshallah ta'ala, read and understand the book and the application of the book. In fact, it has blueprint for restoring the caliphate. Blueprint for restoring the caliphate.